Hello, everyone. Testing. Any questions anyone has?
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
I had a question about the week 4 haiku. The two suttas it's talking about is the Kalama Sutta and the setting in motion the wheel of truth sutta, right?
Yes, that's right.
Just making sure. Thank you.
Supposed to read that before class.
Read.
The one who says the friendly reminder.
Oh, the friendly reminder is about some people who are not turning in their commentaries.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
So I thought, okay.
yeah, some people have been kind of missing in action here. I'm getting a little concerned. I could see that could be a slow start, but we're in week 5. I think it's got a, especially important for me to see the commentary so I can give some feedback.
Okay. Well, I've been turning him in, so I don't have to worry.
Most people have, but I just wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that.
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
I also have a question about that. I have been submitting my work timely, all of it, but I went back into one essay and tinkered with it a little bit and resubmitted, and now it shows that I submitted it late.
Oh, yes. I'm not sure how that works. Don't worry about it. So it's telling me late, but I'm not making any notation of that.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So I'm still getting used
Professor.
to, how the Canvas puts itself together.
Okay. Thank you.
But
Oh,
thanks for
Professor, I just
letting me know.
opened the attachments and yeah, okay, I just read it. I thought it was a reading.
No, it's not. It's not. It's a tortoise and hare story. That's what it is.
Oh, I haven't heard about. I haven't read that story since I was a kid, but that brings back memories.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one. So I put together this little chart, and I'm going to continue to update it so you can see the connection between the commentaries and the haiku essay questions. So the commentaries are directing your attention to a particular topic for each week, and then the haiku essay is the follow-up where you're going to be obviously saying much more based on what you're doing in the readings. So you can see how this works in terms of week 1, week 2. There is a connection between the commentary, but the essay is much more expansive. And then moving on to 5. So the commentary for this week has to do with how convincing the arguments are in the Anatta Sutta. And today we're going to look a little bit more into the sutta itself. So last time we spent most of our time just trying to get a general sense of what the topic is, since, as I mentioned, it's one of the most challenging of all the topics. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint. So most of this is actually the text of the sutta itself. Let me get this to work. There we go. So Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, translated as the discourse on the not self or the non-self. So that's the Anatman, Anatta in Pali. So this is the second discourse that was delivered by the Buddha. I don't discuss it after the first one because it is more challenging, as we'll see, and therefore we went from the first discourse to the Kalama Sutta, and now we're kind of going back. So there is the Buddha, and there are the 5 originally ascetics that he had been a partner with when he was following the Vedic religion, and now they are learning from him. But as we said in the first sutta, it's a little bit of a challenge because at first they're resistant to speaking with him because they think that he was just too weak to continue with the training. And you also might see the deer in the background. Remember, the first sutta is also called the Deer Park Sutta. So we're going to talk a little bit about this triple loop learning. So there's a process that's taking place in this sutta, as there are in all the other suttas. So the first thing that he needs to do is help them suspend their perceptions, which are deluded perceptions, and then he has to redirect them to the insight that he himself has experienced, so that eventually they can let go of all views, the view of no view. So speaking in terms of the triple loop learning process, which is separate from Buddhism, but there's a parallel, we have to stop the inefficiency of shared epistemological resources. And in this particular case, that inefficiency is they have inefficiently been fixating on the reality of the Atman. The idea of the Atman does not come up in the first sutta because it's the core of their belief system. So he has to get their interest in his teaching, and now he's going to kind of cut to that core and to try to provoke them to suspend what they think about Atman. Again, this single, separate, eternal identity that they're seeking. So he's trying to bring about a shift in their thinking process. So if you try to find this Atman, you're not going to find it. That's the insight that he has had. Because everything that is connected with the skandhas, which again, based on Buddhist philosophy, everything that is attached to our sense of identity, how we construct our sense of identity, is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change. And this Atman is supposed to be permanent, is supposed to be completely satisfactory, and it never changes because it's eternal. So where is this thing that you are obsessed about. So once he gets them to question, so this is the beginning of their doubts, just not obliterate their belief, but just for a moment, consider that that might be a mistake to think there is such a thing. And then direct their attention, redirect it to another kind of focus. So stop the insufficiency of shared epistemological sources. So they have this very egocentric focus. So why do they want to find the Atman? Well, it's all about them. It's my Atman because it's single and separate and unique. So it's not a very open way of going about one's life. So change how we talk about this. And that's also found in the text. These are not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. So that self, that Atman you're looking for is not any of those 5 skandhas. You're not going to find it there. So then let go of that project that they've been devoting their lives to because of the inadequacy of epistemological resources. So basically what he's telling them is, that Vedic path that you've been following and that, I followed too, it really doesn't work. It's not going to take you anywhere. But there is an option, and that's the option that is part of his awakening. So in the triple loop learning process, this is called instituted imaginary. So thought coverings, these are assumptions, presumptions, things that we have been conditioned to believe because we haven't applied our critical thinking process to them. And why should we let it go? So change how we think, change how we talk about it, but also change how we live our lives. And towards the end, he talks about being wearied of all the skandhas. So associating yourself with the skandhas or identifying yourself with the skandhas is not really, as we saw in the first sutta, it's not productive. So all the skandhas, we are wearied of them, and instead you want to be passion-free, that is without the thirst and the tanha. You want to be emancipated, so you're not enslaved to these wrong ideas, these delusions. Being emancipated, there is the knowledge that he is emancipated. So not only do you experience emancipation, but you are very clear that you have been emancipated or awakened or enlightened. So remember, there's that 3-step process. It's one thing to have the realization, you have to commit to the realization, and then you have to implement it. Okay? Any questions about this? It's a very simple text, very repetitive text, but actually underneath there is an agenda that the Buddha has in terms of how he's walking them through the way to let go of their deluded view of Atman, which is directly related to the problem of dukkha. Any questions about that? So it's kind of like a cognitive roadmap we've got here. So the text itself is quite different than the first sutta. It's kind of a dialogue, Socratic dialogue process where the questions are asked and answers are exchanged between the Buddha and the audience members. So as typical in all the suttas, thus it was heard, and by me, and me usually refers to Ananda, the guy with the great memory, who was the chief supporter of the Buddha. At one time, the Blessed One was living in Deer Park, same location as the first sutta, near Benares. There, indeed, the Blessed One addressed a group of 5 monks. And they started out as ascetics, Vedic ascetics, and now they are monks. They are followers of the Buddha. But all they know so far is just the Fourfold Noble Truth. So he uses a technique that's called in Latin the reductio ad absurdum. He presents an idea, has them question that idea, and shows that the idea itself is absurd and therefore should be rejected. But they have to come to the conclusion that it should be rejected. So he goes through the 5 skandhas. starting with the first one, which is form. So form means our physical entity, our body, our sense receptors. But remember, there's going to be not just the five senses, but the mind is the sixth sense in Indian philosophy. So form, O monks, is not self. So anatta is not self. If form were self, then form would not lead to affliction. It should obtain regarding form, may my form be thus, may my form not be thus. And indeed, O monks, since form is not self, therefore form leads to affliction, and does not obtain regarding form, may my form be thus, may my form not be thus. So the key word here is my. So if we're looking for this Atman that you guys are so obsessed about, I think he starts out, we can all agree it's not your body. Your body is not your Atman, because Atman does not change. And Atman is something, does not lead to affliction. It is not the cause of dukkha. Because that's one of the reasons, the main reasons they want to realize their Atman so they can get beyond dukkha. This was the intention of the Vedic training. And then they go to the second skanda, feeling, sensation. Feeling is not self. If feeling were self, then it would not lead to affliction. Therefore, I am not identifying myself, my basic being, with this thing that actually does lead to affliction. So the wording is exactly the same as before. And the third one is perception. So again, the problem with perception is that it also leads to affliction. And that violates the definition of the Atman. Atman should be pure bliss, should have nothing to do with dukkha or affliction. Number four, our mental formations, conceptions. They also lead to affliction. Therefore, they cannot be our identity. And then the most tricky one, the one that we talked a little bit about last time, is the notion of consciousness. So this egocentric processing. But he makes the argument that this can't be it also, because it does lead to affliction. Thought can bring you a sense of dukkha. It can cause suffering. And therefore, it doesn't fit the definition of this eternal, unchanging source of bliss. But after he goes through the list and sets forth his beliefs, he comes back to them and he asks them questions. So he wants them not to just accept what he has said. He wants them to think it through for themselves. So that kind of ties in with the Kalama Sutta. So what do you think of this? Is form permanent or impermanent? And the answer is impermanent. That is your material form, your physical being. Is that the correct answer? Is our physical being permanent or impermanent?
Impermanent.
It's impermanent, yes. And in fact, we've got scientific evidence for this. This interesting article, New York Times. The average age of all the cells in an adult's body may turn out to be as young as 7 to 10 years. So the cells in your body have different rates at which they are replaced. So the liver turns over every 300 to 500 days. Your skin, the entire surface, is replaced every 2 weeks. Your red blood cells survive about 100 days before they go to the spleen graveyard. Bones are replaced every 10 years in adults, different for children, they grow faster. Muscle, the ribs average 15.1 years, and the gut is replaced every 15.9 years. So there's literally nothing in your physical body, as far as we can tell, with possibly, the article says, the exception of the heart, that doesn't get changed over time and multiple times replaced. So that seems like pretty good evidence that our physical body is something that is impermanent. Remember, impermanence is one of the core realizations the Buddha had about reality. Everything is impermanent. So it's easy for him to start with the physical body. Anybody have a problem with that conclusion, not just on the part of the Buddha, but also on the part of the audience members? They don't have a problem accepting that. Just as in the first sutta, they didn't have a problem accepting that the path of hedonism was unproductive and unworthy. They already knew that. But they were surprised to hear that the path of asceticism was also unproductive and unworthy. So he starts with the easy things, the easy ideas. Everybody agree with the monks here?
100%.
Because it's
Okay.
obvious the body dies, so it's impermanent.
Yeah, so that's how he's going to lead them along, very carefully crafted argument. So that one's not too hard. So that which is impermanent, is it unsatisfactory or satisfactory? And they say, well, it's unsatisfactory. People are afraid of change. People, particularly if you're a former Vedic follower, you're looking for that eternal Atman. So impermanence is the opposite of eternal, and therefore it is not satisfactory. It's not enough for you. You want something more. So now that which is impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change, is it proper to regard that as this is mine, this I am, this is myself? And easy answer, no. That's not who I think I am. I'm not my physical body. Because it's not eternal, it's impermanent, therefore it is unsatisfactory, and I want more for my special identity than that. So he's got, of the 5 skandhas, he's gotten rid of one of them as a possible contender for the position of Atman. So that's not who I am. I'm something more than this ever-changing set of cells in a physical body. So then he moves on to feeling or sensation. Is feeling permanent or is it impermanent? And the answer is what?
Very impermanent.
Very impermanent. And here I'm going to bring in as an expert witness David Hume in the Treatise of Human Nature. Interestingly enough, he studied Pyrrhonian skepticism, which was a great influencer on the development of his own philosophy. And we now know that Pyrrhonian skepticism was influenced by Buddhist philosophy, specifically Madhyamika philosophy, because the skeptic Pyrrho actually went to India, where he met some Buddhist practitioners, following along with the army of Alexander the Great, who was there to conquer and not to study Buddhism. Of course, at the time, David Hume didn't know the connection with Buddhism. So that's why he has this very Buddhist view about our identity. He believes exactly like the Buddha that our identity is a social construct. So here in the treatise, he's talking about our perceptions, excuse me, our feelings, feelings in the sense of sensations. So pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. They're constantly in flux. They're impermanent. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived. So he's thinking of self in the sense of soul, which is very close to what Atman is. It's something that is eternal and does not change, something that is permanent. So anything that is constantly changing, like the physical body, or like your feelings, that can't be yourself, because you've already decided that yourself has to be something that does not change. And that's why it has the chance of immortality in an afterlife. David Hume, by the way, was a famous atheist at a time when it wasn't that easy to be an atheist. He was such a hard case that while he was on his deathbed, several people tried to convert him to Christianity, and he said no. He's died an atheist. So consequently, yes.
I
What was that?
So,
Mhm.
isn't it, so with the state of impermanence with Atman, if couldn't the Atman also be in a state of impermanence as well? If our body goes through these changes and everything changes like that, and like impermanence is, then can't the Atman still exist with those changes as well? Or is this just a counter argument to them to where, or your original energy just is permanent and it doesn't change?
It does not change. That goes into the primal definition of Atman. It is unlike anything in the physical world. It is eternal, and that's why you can look forward to this immortal life in the afterlife. So
But
it's
couldn't
absolutely essential that it cannot change.
Okay, so it was their understanding. So he was challenging their understanding of what the Atman is.
That there is such a thing as an Atman. So you can always describe something that does not exist. You can, describe a unicorn, but unicorns don't exist. You can describe a square circle, but it also does not exist. So this idea, as Jung calls it, there is no such idea that is of the soul. What we have instead is a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. So many cultures had this notion that there has to be something about it. So we realize everything changes about our life, but there's got to be something that doesn't change, something that encapsulates our true identity, because that's the thing that we're betting on so that we can have this immortal existence even after our physical death. And again, very unusual at the time in Europe. David Hume made this argument, but it was in large part influenced by his experience with Pyrrhonian skepticism. So when people read this argument, the wording is almost identical to what you can find in Buddhist texts. One of the reasons I wanted to bring in Hume is that this idea of an-Atman that we find in Buddhism is not actually that rare. We find it accepted in scientific circles, find it in David Hume, an Enlightenment philosopher. So it's not a one-off in Buddhism. So everybody see David Hume's point, that your feelings are constantly in flux, so that can't be the real you. Assuming you think that the real you is something that is totally constant. And that's the working definition of Atman here. Everybody clear on that?
So far, so good.
Okay. So that which is impermanent, is it unsatisfactory or satisfactory? Again, unsatisfactory. So he knows how they're going to answer this. That which is impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change. Is it proper to regard this as myself? And they say, no, that's not what we're looking for. We want something, again, that's permanent, so it can be eternal, and therefore lead me to bliss and not to something that's unsatisfactory. So that's not the real me. So then we move on to perception. Is perception permanent or impermanent? So that's taking in the sense data and then processing that data. And we talked a lot about the idea of perceptions, lakshana, in Buddhism. So perceptions, the perception that there's a snake curled up in the corner of my dark room. As Inada said, yes, in fact, you are perceiving that, but that doesn't mean there is a snake coiled up in the corner of your room. But that's what the sense data is being processed as that by your mind. So it's impermanent, unsatisfactory. This can't be my true identity. And they agree. So what do you think of mental formations? We might use the word conceptions here, or ideas. Are they permanent or impermanent? Well, impermanent. Those that are impermanent, are they satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Again, unsatisfactory. those that are impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change, that can't be the self, the I that I'm looking for. And now we come to consciousness. And this is where things are getting a little bit more difficult. So yes, physical body is constantly changing, our feelings, sensory experiences, our emotions are changing, our perceptions, our interpretations of sensory data constantly changing, even our ideas are in a flux. But what about consciousness? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Now, we kind of talked a little bit about this last time, because consciousness is often seized upon as the equivalent of Atman. So as long as we've got consciousness, and we don't deny the existence of consciousness in some form, then that's got to be it. That's got to be what we're looking for. But remember, as we saw last time, consciousness is the product of the first four skandhas. It does not precede those four skandhas. It comes after those skandhas. We create the notion of a separate consciousness. The observer who is observing sensory data, having sensations, creating perceptions, and turning them into concepts or ideas. And then we say, oh, I had those. Remember we looked at the example of the snake, that all of those take place without any sense of, I am seeing the snake. The last thing I do is add the I to the seeing. The seeing takes place without any sense of consciousness. It's pre-conscious. So is consciousness permanent or impermanent? What's the answer here? They say it's impermanent. So let's take a look at that chart we had last time. So again, we've got levels of awareness here, levels of wakefulness or consciousness here, and only the blue part is consciousness. When we get into general aesthetic and a comatose state, there is no consciousness. So consciousness apparently is impermanent. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not there.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to understand this but disagree with this?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Yeah, this is the most controversial concept, I think, in all of Buddhist philosophy. So that's why I kind of waited before bringing it out here. And it's also the case that the whole theory of consciousness has quite a history in the development of Buddhist philosophy. So as we talked about it last time, the Buddha is just telling us that consciousness is not the Atman that you might have thought it was. He doesn't find a replacement for Atman. He doesn't provide a substitute for identity. He doesn't really have a sense of or care about that. All he wants to do is get rid of our obsession with the Atman and this eternal consciousness, because he sees that as blocking us from getting rid of the Tanha and the Dukkha. Because if there is no single unconnected sense of self, then there is no problem of Tanha. You can get rid of those desires because there's no I who is desirous of those things. There's no I who is greedy. There's no I who is angry. There's no I who is ignorant. Now, as Buddhist philosophy develops and philosophical speculation becomes much more sophisticated over literally thousands of years, there's a lot of talk about consciousness in Buddhism. And there's something called the Alaya Vijnana. Vijnana is consciousness, one of the terms for consciousness. Alaya is more like sometimes they translate it as cosmic consciousness. So that's a whole nother aspect. And then, as I mentioned last time, when we get into Chan Buddhism, they start talking not about consciousness, but about Buddha mind or Buddha nature. And so they do have a positive rather than a negative way of talking about our identity. So our identity is our Buddha mind or our Buddha nature. But that's not the kind of talk that the Buddha is interested in. He's interested in getting us to let go of these misleading perceptions. And that's all we're looking at, just what he's saying in this particular sutta. And then as we move along and look at other discussions by other Buddhists, we'll see that they make use of different kind of terminology. So it's a very, very contentious notion in Buddhism. But in terms of what the Buddha himself says, and remember, that's what Inada is basically trying to emphasize in his analysis. What is it that the Buddha himself has said? And the Buddha told his followers, well, if I didn't say something, don't make anything up. Whatever I talked about, share with others, but don't take it upon yourself to expand on what I have said. Although, of course, many people did try to do that. So let's see if we can come to some understanding about this notion of consciousness. When we're out of the blue zone, we are technically unconscious. That's where we get the conclusion on the part of the monks that consciousness is impermanent. What do you think? Consciousness in the sense of something that can be tracked by scientific methods. Let's put it that way. Does that seem justified?
So, like during meditation, where would that be on this graph?
Ah, good question. I'm tempted to say that if we could add something to the top of the list, because it would be the state of ultimate awareness and ultimate wakefulness, because literally that's what it means when you meditate and you become awakened. You are awake to reality as a whole. And therefore, when scientific studies are done of particularly long-time meditators, they find that their brains are functioning differently than the so-called average person. They are much more aware and much more awake.
Supreme state of consciousness, if you will.
Yes, an extended state of consciousness, yes. So if we think of wakefulness in a Buddhist sense, then it could be at the tip of the blueness. So it is a kind of consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it is not an Atman consciousness, because it's not a sense of being single and separate. So you move from the egocentric to the allocentric. And as they sometimes use the language, you become one with everything. Forget yourself and become the universe, as Hakuin puts it. So that would be up here. And I think that that's a very important point, because that's why the Buddha is so concerned with the problem of the Atman. As long as you're trying to hang on to that porcupine of Atman, you're not going to make the breakthrough to the highest level of awareness and wakefulness. So you got to leave that behind as a mistaken notion. It's only going to drag you down. And it wasn't real to begin with. So I think that's part of the problem that people have with this notion of what constitutes identity. The Buddha is not saying that you don't have a sense of identity, because in all his questions, is that you, as he asks about each of those 5 skandhas, is that yourself? So it's not that there is no self, it's what you thought it was, that's not it. But he doesn't go on to provide an alternative definition. And that's I think, very important. But as long as you have that narrow sense of self, it's going to hold you back. You're going to have to let that go, forget yourself, and become the universe. And there's nothing to lose but the delusion. So Atman itself is a thought covering, a delusion. And sometimes what I would use the example, let's say I come into the classroom and I tell you I lost my my contact lens. So I have to find my contact lens, and we start looking for it. Well, the problem is I never had a contact lens. Therefore, we could spend hours and hours looking for something that never existed. And that's what the Vedic followers were doing. They were looking for this Atman, as Siddhartha had been looking for years. And finally, Siddhartha stopped and said, wait a minute. Why is it I can't find this thing? Is it something I'm doing wrong? Or is it possibly because it never existed to begin with? And that was a big part of his breakthrough. I've been misled. That's why the text often says something that has not been heard before. So in his time, people believed in the Atman. People believed in reincarnation. And he's saying something they have not heard before. So a very specific way of looking at the whole notion of consciousness, but which also seems to be validated by the way science talks about consciousness. There are levels of it, and then there's places where it does not exist. There is no consciousness.
But didn't science actually disprove that? I mean, even when people are in coma, they can still scan for activity in the brain when a person is in a coma, and that's how they tell if somebody is there or not.
Oh, but the activity in the brain is not consciousness. Yes, there is pre-conscious activity. So consciousness is this wakefulness, this drowsiness, this light sleep, the deep sleep. But when you're in that coma, your brain is still functioning. So when I was put into an induced coma to have that minor surgery, my brain was functioning, but I was not there. The structure of the self-identity was not there. That's what's missing. That's the part that is the social construct. That's just a form of upaya, a skillful means.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So I think of all the terms that we use in Buddhism, consciousness is the most difficult one because it has so many differing definitions for people. So in this case, we're just looking at what is it in terms of how the Buddha is using it and how his audience members are responding to it. Because at the time, early India, even hundreds of years before the time of the Buddha, they were totally fascinated by the whole notion of consciousness. What happens when you're dreaming? There is a kind of consciousness in your dreams, and very often we can wake up and remember what was happening there. And they thought that that was an alternate reality. In fact, among Australian Aborigines, they talk about dream time. The actual reality is when we're dreaming, and when we're so-called awake, that's just a dream. They just reverse the order. So it's a fundamental issue, I think, that human beings have had for quite a long time. So consciousness, definitely there is something there. It comes in different forms, different levels. As it says, levels of consciousness. That's what the article is about. You can track it in the brain. You can see how the brain is functioning differently, whether you're at conscious wakefulness or you're in that coma. They even factor in here sleepwalking, because when someone's walking in their sleep, so it says complex, partial, and absence seizures, vegetative state. So people can be walking around and look like they're conscious, and you can even talk to them and they will respond to you, but it's partial seizure or an absence and a vegetative state.
I think I meet people like that every day.
So that actually ties in with the next slide. Consciousness constitutes no more than 5% of brain activity and may be as low as 1%. I have to say, when I came across this, I was surprised. So what is technically called consciousness, that complete awareness at the highest level of that blue range, it's actually quite rare. So 95%, at least 95% of our brain activity is pre-conscious. I don't want to use the word unconscious. There's too many Freudian things going on with that. But it's not consciousness in the sense that we are conscious of ourselves doing something. Much of what we do is on automatic pilot. It takes a lot of energy, physical energy, to get your brain to do that. So it's very demanding. And maybe as low as 1%. So that's what is meant here by consciousness, which includes the social construct of your single separateness, the self versus the other. And it takes a lot of energy to maintain that self versus the other. I think you can see how this ties in with the problem of dukkha, because as soon as you have the distinction between self and other, it sets up things like greed and envy. You know, that person has more than I have, so I want to take it away from them, or I want to get more than they have. That other out there is threatening to me, and therefore I have to act aggressively to protect myself. So consciousness has positive aspects, but it also has negative aspects. It causes a sense of alienation from reality as a whole and from others. So human beings as social animals, the individuation process was helpful because it means that some people could step outside of the box, so we're not walking around like ants following each other through tunnels. Some of us are going our different ways, but still we need to have that connectedness. So that's what the Buddha is pointing back to. Yes, we are definitely interconnected. All those 90% of the cells in your body that are doing all sorts of things to sustain your life. And only 10% of the cells are actually what you would consider yourself. So that's what he's really talking about. Other questions about this? So to kind of wrap up the fifth skandha, he asks them, well, you've already said that consciousness is impermanent. Is it unsatisfactory or satisfactory? Again, they say unsatisfactory. What is impermanent, unsatisfactory, subject to change? Is it proper to regard that as this is mine? And he gets the same answer. Indeed not. That's not what I was trying to find. Therefore, surely, O monks, whatever form, past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or fine, low or lofty, far or near, all that form must be regarded with proper wisdom, according to reality. So he's got them to do the reality check on each of the skandhas. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. I cannot be reduced to any one of those skandhas. Same thing with feeling. Same thing with perception. And finally, the same thing with the mental formations. And then ultimately with consciousness. So none of those are what our identity is about. That's not our true identity. Why is that important? Well, once you have had that realization So seeing thus gets wearied of form, gets wearied of feeling, gets wearied of perception, gets wearied of mental formations, gets wearied of consciousness. Being wearied, he becomes passion-free. That is, without those passions, that passivity that gives rise to thirst and kama. So let's dig a little deeper into this weariness. Weary of form, weary of feeling, weary of perception, weary of mental formations, weary of consciousness. So once we see that each of them is impermanent and unsatisfactory, what do you think he means by being weary of them? It's not a word that we use that often in English anymore. What does it mean to be weary of something?
Well, sounds like to be cautious, maybe, or like,
To be tired of something.
Yeah, kind of keep it at a distance. So the opposite of that would be embracing it. So if you embrace form because you think it's you, or your emotional state, or your perceptions, your processing of sense data, or your mental formations, your ideas, or your consciousness, if you think that one or more of them is your true self, then you think, well, this is me. This is how I am defined. I'm stuck with this kind of body, or I'm stuck with this emotional state, or this way of looking at the world, or this way of thinking about the world, or this way of interacting as the self versus the other. So each one of those is a limitation to your understanding of reality. So the seeing here is seeing in the sense of becoming wise. Once you realize that that physical embodiment is not you, and your emotional state is not you, and your perceptions and your ideas and your consciousness, there's more to it than that. Let's start with the body, because there's a lot of talk in society today about embodied self and which kinds of bodies are acceptable and which are not acceptable, and how we should regard people in terms of their looks or ignore their looks. In what way is it a good thing to be weary of our attachment, let's say, to physical form? What's the advantage of that? The whole problem of body shaming. What is
Well, it's
considered
like,
acceptable?
so it's like you get attached to your perceptions of yourself, and then you can't be more, I guess, or you limit yourself through binding yourself to those perceptions.
Yes, yes. So there's a movement that's been going on for some years now, kind of liberating ourselves from societal standards of what constitutes the perfect form. I guess one of the best examples is, beauty contests. When you look at the winners of beauty contests for, over the years, there seems to be a certain kind of body type that wins. Or even looking at bodybuilders, when they have those kinds of bodybuilding contests, there's a certain type that wins. But is that what that person actually is? Can they be reduced to their physical form? Now, in some cases, people do tend to reduce themselves to their physical form. But is that the real you? I've heard disabled people have the same kind of argument, that they feel that they're not accepted as a real person because of their disability. And they think that's totally unfair, that they're a real person too, even though they might look somewhat different than other people. That's not who they are. What you see in their physical form, there's so much more to them than that. So if we all got weary of form in that sense, would that be a kind of a liberation for everybody?
So I mean, I'm kind of confused here, because if Buddha is also saying that like consciousness and feeling are impermanent and to be wary of those as well, it's like, then what would constitute who we are, kind of thing. So like, to that question, I don't know if it would be a benefit for somebody to be like, oh, I'm not this physical form, because then it's like, then who are they? Kind of, you know where I'm coming from?
Yes, yes. So he does not go forward and give us a new answer to what they are, because I think he's setting us up so that we can make that discovery for ourselves. So he's not going to tell us what we are. He's going to help us to see what we thought we were and that we're actually not that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some, again, sense of identity. And that's why later Buddhists, they spend a lot more time developing that, talking about things like Buddha mind and Buddha nature. So I think if we substitute attachment for being wearied, so we realize that we're attached to form, and we're tired of being attached. We're tired of being attached to our emotional state, or to our perceptions, or to our ideas, or even to our sense of consciousness as a single separate self. So all of that is really holding us back from seeing reality as it actually is. So as he says in the next piece, in his freedom from passion, he is emancipated. Being emancipated, there is the knowledge that he is emancipated. So it's not enough to have it, but you have to know that you're emancipated. So you can just leave it behind. That's the letting go part. He knows birth is exhausted, lived is the holy life. What has had to be done is done. Therefore is nothing more of this becoming. So you don't get stuck in impermanence. You're not trying to get someplace. This is just what it is. So again, the freedom from passion in the sense of something that makes you passive. You are controlled by the physical form, or you're controlled by the feelings, or by the perceptions, or by the ideas, or by this socially constructed sense of consciousness. There's something more to your reality than any or all of those.
I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is no Atman that is supposed to incarnate multiple times until it achieves a certain level in its development, that it's no longer incarnated, if there is no such thing, that means that everyone only has one lifetime. Those who get to a level of Buddha and those who do not, right?
That's one of the things the Buddha did not speculate on, because I think he had in mind that he has experienced this awakening. He is very convinced that other people can have the same experience, because he doesn't think that he's some kind of special being. Mm-hmm. And therefore, he decides to create this community, the Sangha, where people will provide a mutual support system, and then they can all have the environment in which they can come to that same experience. So it does seem to be that his notion was that, yes, you can all get it done now, just like I did.
But even if you don't get it done, you still don't incarnate anymore because there's nothing to incarnate.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And I think that's probably why the notion of reincarnation kind of wormed its way back into the Buddhist thought process, because some people thought, I just can't do it. It's too much for me to do. I don't want to make that commitment now, so I'm gonna hold it off for some
Believe
future.
that I can do it in the next lifetime.
Yes, that's right. But I don't think that's what he had in mind. And another interesting aspect here has to do with the Sangha, where you have monks and nuns, all of whom are practicing celibacy. And I think perhaps he thought that everyone would do that, make that choice. And therefore, that would be the end of the human race. Nobody would be coming back anyway.
That didn't work.
No, because there are a lot of people who still wanted a kind of a family life. It's not that he was, forcing people into that, but he thought, well, gee, obviously they're going to want to do this. This is the express way to awakening. So I think everybody's going to want to come and join the Sangha with us. It didn't quite work out that way. So I kind of like thinking in those ways because it shows the humanness of the Buddha, that he has this experience and he wants to share it with others. And he can't predict exactly how they're going to respond to it, but hey, this was great for me. I think everybody can really benefit from it. I'm going to, go out there and share it with them. And in this particular case where he says he knows birth is exhausted, there's a couple ways that we could read that birth is exhausted, meaning that there's not going to be any rebirth. So this is a tacit acknowledgement that there is no such thing as reincarnation again. I think he wants to be very careful because he knows that the people are still believing in that. But it was actually a good thing if you didn't have to be reborn. Because the rebirth part was something that people assumed had to take place rather than the express lane. So actually, let's take a look at the structure here. So he does seem to have a breakthrough here. Pleased, the group of 5 monks were delighted with the exposition of the Blessed One. Moreover, as this exposition was being spoken, the minds of the group of 5 monks were free of defilements without attachment. So they were weary of the 5 skandhas, so no longer attached to any of them. And then it says that time there were 6 arahants in the world. So they had joined, in a way, the rank of the Buddha. That doesn't mean they're Buddhas, but they had come to a certain level of realization. So these are the progressive levels that are discussed in terms of Buddhist practice. So you start out as a voice hearer or a stream enterer. So remember we talked about the notion of samsara as one side of the shore of the river and nirvana as the other. So in order to get from samsara to nirvana, you have to enter the river and move across. The Dharma was supposed to be the vehicle on which you would make that journey. If it were an individual journey in Theravada, then you would go over yourself. You would make the trip on your own. But in Mahayana, they envisioned the big vehicle where multiple individuals would get on the raft. In this case, it would be the vehicle of Mahayana Buddhism, the great ferry boat. And then the Bodhisattva would be the one who's going to pilot us across the river. But we're still in the level of Theravada, so that's why it's an individual basis. So you start out as a voice hearer who is literally one who hears the voice of the Buddha. And the best way to do that is to become a member of the Sangha, because you could get this teaching from him all the time, this interaction. And that's known as a stream enterer. So that you're on the shore of samsara, and now you have decided that you want to get over to that other shore of nirvana. So you enter the stream. And then it was assumed that you are a once returner. Now, you could return in the next life. That's how it's usually interpreted. So I've entered the stream and I only have to come back one more time and I'm going to be able to become awakened. Or are you returning for further study? That could be another way to interpret once returner. So you're in there, you're working to get from samsara to nirvana, but you need a little bit more time, a little bit more practice. And then you get to a certain point in that river where you can see the other bank very clearly and you're a non-returner. You're not gonna turn back. You don't have to go back. You know now that you can actually be successful. So you're almost there. And as the text tells us, the 5 monks had now joined the Buddha at the level of the Arhat, the so-called perfect one. Notice not using the word Buddha, but somebody who's definitely going to make it. They're almost there at the shore of nirvana, and that's where they had come to, that they had reached the level of realization that it was almost like a guarantee that they were going to get to nirvana. It doesn't mean they're there yet, but they're about to go there. So there is a process that you go through. You have to decide that, yes, this is something that I want to do, and then you have to work at it and commit yourself to doing it. And then again, maybe you need a little bit more time. And then there's a certain point where you realize I'm on the right path. This is going to be it. And then finally you succeed. So that's where they had arrived at from having this interaction with the Buddha. Now, what makes it all possible is that they have let go of that blockage, which was the notion of the Atman. That was something that would always be holding them back. Everybody see the process here?
So would like at the third step, would that be like full devotion kind of thing?
I tend to see it more as, I'm not there yet, but I know I'm going to make it.
Hmm.
So you can see the goal ahead of you, and it's within your grasp. You just got to push a little bit more.
Because I was thinking, like, when it comes to like raising children or something like that, how far like juggling both of that, like how would that work in a way?
Oh, as a what they call a layperson, with somebody with a family.
Yeah.
I think that the Buddha saw that as possible but difficult, and that's why he thought the Sangha was the best solution, that is to become a monk or a nun. But there were people who were lay people, family people. There's a wonderful sutra in the Mahayana text that talks about, it's called the Lankavatara, and it's a man who's a merchant. And he is at the same level of teaching as the Buddha. So the Buddha sends his disciples to learn from him. And that's kind of a breakthrough. Oh, yes, monks learning from non-monks. Oh, this is radical stuff. But in Mahayana, they get much more expansive. But at the time of the Buddha, they seem to still think that, well, you have to have complete devotion. And the lay people then would be the ones who would delay their awakening to a future life. Other questions here?
Oh yeah, Professor, I have a question. So for a non-returner and a perfect one, they're pretty much dedicated, but the only difference is for a non-returner, they're still not 100% sure if they are committed or they will make it or not. Am I correct?
Well, they've made the full commitment, but they're not quite as far along. So the perfect one is, let's say they're almost at nirvana. Maybe got two more steps to get there.
Okay, and for a non-returner, that means like they don't have any intentions of going back, like returning, or they're committed
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Okay, so meaning they're not even even though they're not sure if they will make it or not, but they don't have any intentions of returning. Am I correct?
That's right. That's how I would interpret it. So they're not having any regrets, no second thoughts. They're just going to stick with it.
Oh, okay, but they're just not sure if they could achieve nirvana yet, right? Like they still have like a little bit of doubt. Am I correct? For a non-returner?
I don't think it's so much the doubt, but they need more practice. They need
Oh,
to continue their practice.
so that's the main difference between 3 and 4.
That's the way I would see it. And as you can see, it's a set of concrete imagery that can be interpreted by different people in different ways. Because he's talking to an audience where most people have basically no education, and he's trying to use these images to stimulate their own thinking and to imagine themselves entering the stream and being a once returner, non-returner, and then becoming an arhat.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, we got a couple other supports here. Bruce Lee, who is a student of philosophy. We do not live for, we simply live. What man has to get over is consciousness. So that sense of consciousness, we have to get weary of that consciousness. The consciousness of himself. Life should be a natural process in which the development of the mind is not allowed to throw the natural flow of life out of balance. That consciousness is a potential trap for internal mentation, that you kind of get wrapped up in your head, in your ideas. Formality could be a hindrance to progress. This is applicable to everything, including philosophy. So we could get stuck by our own ideas, philosophical ideas. Another source, William James, American philosopher, probably one of the greatest American philosophers produced. And here he's talking about true happiness consists of getting out of oneself. So what these quotes are hinting at is the inherent problem of consciousness as an obstacle, which seems to be what the Buddha is getting at. True happiness consists of getting out of oneself, but the point is not only to get out, you must stay out. And to stay out, you must have some absorbing errand.
That's a really great way to put it, actually. Yeah.
And why do you have to get out of yourself? If the self is the Atman, I don't want to get out of myself. I want to get deeper into myself. But if the self is that construct that is building barriers between me and reality and between me and others, then I have to get out and stay out and have some absorbing errand, which in the case of the Buddha is to share his experience with others. So you're not living for yourself, some egocentric purpose, but you see that sense of interconnectedness with reality as a whole. And another one here, this is from a German source, an Austrian physician and philosopher. The true thinker is satisfied with having arrived at the limits of thinking. And it is a wise providence that has established those limits. Because where thinking must end, a person should start acting. Again, a warning about this internal mentation, just getting stuck in your head. And that acting is one's real destination. Very pragmatic. So let's take a look at the 3 suttas we've looked at so far. The first one talks about turning the wheel, the 2 extremes that are unworthy or worthless and unproductive. So that would be the extremes of asceticism and hedonism. They are epistemologically bankrupt. They can't get you anywhere. They're not going to produce anything. They're not worth your time and trouble. And that's where the middle way comes in. In the Kalama Sutta, we are looking at truth claims. So what I think and what I say, the claims that I make. But it's not just thinking about them and saying them. in terms of implementing them. Which truth claims are really true? So the claim is pretending it's true, but the Buddha provides them with the tools to try to decide which truth claims they should actually act upon. If it's a harmful recommendation, then you should avoid it. If it's beneficial, then you should follow it. How do I know if it's harmful or beneficial? Well, if it has the 3 poisons connected to it, it's harmful. And if it doesn't, then it's beneficial. And if you're able to follow that, verify the truth claims that are beneficial and without 3 poisons, then you arrive at the 4 exalted dwellings, those uplifting emotional states: sense of empathy, compassion, joy, and ultimately the equanimity. And here in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, we've got the 5 skandhas, which were associated with identity, but especially consciousness. Examining each of them in turn, the Buddha asks the monks about their leading to affliction, their state of impermanence, the fact that they're unsatisfactory. So there's really nothing there that we should try to hang on to. Now, as we've talked about, he doesn't provide a conceptual replacement for that. What he has instead is acting, and particularly the action that comes along with meditation and sharing the results with others. So the question here for the haiku essay, so based on the challenge to Atman or soul that's presented in the Anatta Sutta, how would you respond to Krishnamurti's question? So his questions were on Tuesday's PowerPoint. He asks you, have you found out for yourself whether there is a soul? Like the Buddha, he's not trying to push anything on you. Have you actually found it? Or is it an idea that has been handed down to you? Is there something permanent, continuous, which is beyond thought? That's his definition of the Atman, or the soul. So what do you understand about this topic of Atman or non-Atman? How do you analyze the arguments that are attached? And why is this a significant doctrine in Buddhist philosophy? It's one of the core structures of Buddhist philosophy. Because once you've gotten rid of this, lots of possibilities emerge. Any questions about this essay? Krishnamurti's questions are an interesting way to approach it. Just how would you answer these questions? And I've used this before, and sometimes people say, yeah, I did find it, and then I'll describe what they found. So it's asking you to either verify the reality of something like an Atman or soul, consider it as possibly a social construct that's being passed down, and whether or not either of those is the case, what's the likelihood of this permanent, continuous thing that goes beyond thought itself? If there is such a thing as an Atman or soul, it would have to predate thought. Any questions about that? Okay. So next week, we're going to start on the Mahayana Sutras, and those are contained in the Kanza text. But the first one is actually the Lotus Sutra, one chapter from the Lotus Sutra, which is already posted on Canvas. I'll send it directly to you by email to make sure that you have access to it. So there are 28 chapters in the Lotus Sutra. We're going to look at one of them, but I think you'll see some definite differences from the structure of the sutta texts. Anybody have any questions here? Anything you need for the, I love that duck, a really cute duck.
Darn tootin'.
Okay, so everybody have a great weekend. Gonna stop the video.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good weekend. Be safe.
Thank you.
You too, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.